So I think this is the sign to start. So welcome in this huge room. So we were discussing previously whether it is more stressful to work in an empty room or in a full room of that size. Well, first of all, thank you very much for participating in this panel discussion about a topic which is for us very interesting. Do we need new strategies in order to reach men affected by violence? My name is Bianca Biwer from WEISSER RING, and well, we fully realize that it is very difficult to reach out to people who are affected by violence. And let me introduce you to the 4 members of the team who will then introduce themselves. Meinolf Hartmann, Klaus Schwerma, Jana Peters, and Andreas Haase. They will introduce themselves by saying a couple of words on themselves, what they do, and they are all the specialists in the field. So for this reason, I do not want to dwell on hard facts and figures. Well, they are certainly part of our analysis because, well, the reality is that we can hardly reach men affected by violence. And according to police statistics, we see that, well, especially as far as men affected by violence are concerned, well, we have a gray zone with a high number of non-reported cases. However, police statistics show us that men are affected by different types of crimes in high percentages. For example, 60% of men between 20 and 35 years of age are victims of violence. And this means that we have a very large group of victims. But in terms of home violence, well, this percentage ranges from a very low percentage up to 20%. Of course, we have to differentiate a little bit, but well, this means that we have a very high number of non-reported cases. As far as our association is concerned, for example, we see that, well, compared to the general number, we have a very tiny number of men who look for aid and support. And that's why we are going to talk about this topic with some experts here in this panel. What can we do as a society, but also as concrete representatives of the associations? What can we change in order to provide a contribution? Well, let me first of all start with a brief round of introductions, and then we will go to the nitty-gritty. Meinolf Hartmann, he is the CEO of fairmann GUG, so fair towards other people, but also towards oneself, and that's very interesting. Learn how to live without violence. He is also a trainer, a natural health professional. He has been working in the field for more than 25 years. And so I will let him talk about his work. Then we have Jana Peters. Well, we heard, I see dissents, for example. So here too, we have a very long experience. Well, he's also working for a long time. He has been working for a long time on projects dedicated to young men and teenagers. Jana Peters, she's a university student. She worked in the Center for work on men. She wrote a dissertation on the conditions to be put in place to create accommodation facilities for men for men who are victims of violence. She also published that as a book. And her quotation, well, you live only once. So Jana Peters has a lot of facts and figures of non-reported cases, especially concerning protection residencies for men. Then on the left, we have Andreas Haase. What is interesting in his resume is that he works as an engineer, but he's also a freelancer, and he works as a coach, as a consultant and advisor. Then in 2008, he started focusing on frustration management, and he set up another association. His quotation: "We don't need to be superheroes." And again, he also provides consultancy for men in Bielefeld. So first of all, I would like to ask the experts to describe a little bit the daily work they do in the field of prevention of violence and men affected by violence. And of course, we invite you to participate in the discussion. There's a microphone in the middle of the room. So if anything comes up to your mind, or if you have a question for one of the speakers, please come to the microphone, and let's try to make this session as interactive as possible. So let's start with this report. So what about your experiences? What about your core business? You come first. So Meinolf. Well, we have been working in that field for 10 years, but well, to tell you the truth, I have been working in Heidelberg for 25 years, and we have been focusing on men violence. We started as an intervention center against violence, and so we worked for and with offenders for the city of Heidelberg. And then the situation evolved because men who were offenders then changed, and we started analyzing also the situation whereby men are victims of violence. And sometimes we realized that they are the same people. Though we had many men who were victims when they were children and teenagers. Well, this is not a justification for their violent acts, but they then became offenders somehow. And so we decided to focus on men who experienced violence themselves. And so for this reason, in the beginning, we decided to set up a sort of hotline for men. And well, then we made up our mind, because it shouldn't be an emergency hotline, but rather a consultancy number. So in the 1990s, we changed a little bit, and men came to us for consultancy. So we had a men intervention center, and we changed the name in order not to stigmatize offenders. Then we had the hotline, And thirdly, and this is very important in my opinion, we organized anti-violence trainings, especially for young people. So we organized 6 to 9 courses per year with teenagers, because we think it is very important to perceive one's own emotions during that specific age period so as to react properly. So this is it as far as my professional experience is concerned. A question. You said anti-violence training. Is it something that works preventively? That is, with a preventive approach, you avoid men become violent. But within the framework of today's panel discussion, it is also important not to fall victims of violence. Yes, this is very important. We provide anonymous support, and this is really key, because sometimes I receive phone calls from colleagues complaining that they do not even tell their name or the telephone number. So, you know, sometimes people call and they say they pretend this is not their problem, but it's a problem of a friend of theirs or a colleague. But simply because when they fall victims of violence, they don't know how to manage that, how to cope with that. For example, if they were offenders in the past, well, it doesn't make sense to go to the police station and to report about a woman having violence against them. So this is a huge obstacle that needs to be overcome. Another important element is that for men who exercised violence themselves, you can hardly understand how the game actually works. And this is also something that we realized. Men who do not perceive themselves as victims because they cannot explain exactly how violence works and what violence is. If a woman is hit, well, this is clearly violence. It's a physical act. But when men is hit, is beaten up, well, it's not usually perceived as a violence, but psychic violence is, in the long run, a form of violence which is extremely detrimental. But this threshold between violence and non-violence is very difficult to distinguish, and especially for young adults. Being called a victim when you are at school is very difficult. So when you participate in competitions or contests, the fact of being victims and asking for help is not easy at all. Well, this is something that we realize in the WEISSER Ring too. The fact of helping victims is per se a great obstacle for women and especially for men. And then we have the issue of the definition. What do we mean by violence? And we will talk about this more in detail. And this is a very important topic, because we have to reach a clear definition if we want people to ask for help. And Mr. Schwerma, what about you? What is your professional experience? You have been working in this field for a long time. I've been working in Bundesforum Männer. It's a general association that gathers about 40 associations where we have a lot of large organizations, for example, the federal trade unions or the trade unions of school, but also the Catholic Association of Men, and also smaller institutions and organizations which are members of our umbrella association. And we as an umbrella organization try to pursue try to pursue fair policy. Well, men-related policy is the most traditional concept, but in our case, we have slightly changed the spirit and the rationale of our policy. In our association, we try to reach equal treatment, also in cooperation with women, but in particular, we try and identify specific needs that men have in certain situations in their life. For example, in 2010, we started being involved in the political arena. We started to be heard and considered. Of course, there have been some changes. And talking about changes, I can say that the fact of having identified the specific needs of men has now become clearer and more evident. Now, in our discussions here, we see that there are surveys and studies underway. Well, it's no surprise when you usually hear that men tend to be offenders. That's a fact, but they are also victims. And strengthening this discussion is very important. Well, the fact that here at the German Prevention Congress, we discuss the violence against men in households, well, is something absolutely new. Well, 10 years ago, we would have never considered that topic. And this is my experience. In our association, we have also a website. It's a network of consultancy. And with a map, we try to provide a low threshold offer for consultancy to men so that men can look and see whether they have an offer of that kind in their city. On the other hand, you also see on that men where you have gaps and where no consultancy is provided to men who are victims of violence. There are large gaps, large white spots on the map where no consultancy is provided. But in the meantime, we've managed to develop about 350 offers with the relevant documents. So we have some positive and negative aspects, but this is our history. Well, I know there are white spots, but as far as the offerings are concerned, are they really used? Well, I think Andreas Haase can better provide you with some facts and figures, but we also see in our office that although we are not a consultancy organization, in the last 1-2 years, we have been receiving an increasing number of phone calls of people asking for help because of this or that problem. And also the number of page views on our website is steadily increasing, and that's good news. But in terms of real statistics and up to which extent all this is translated into consultancy, I don't know. Jana Peters, what about your professional experience? What can you say in terms of facts, figures, and experiences? I work at the Coordination Center for the Protection of Men Victims of Violence. I've been working there since 2019. We work at the level of multipliers and at the political level. We provide advice and consultancy to multipliers, to men-related institutions, and to consultancy offices as well. We provide provide information to politicians. I try to support this topic through scientific work in particular. So we analyze data in an anonymized form. We develop annual statistics. This year will be the second time statistics are published, and we develop quality data together with men prevention institutions, and this data is now the basics for the network of men associations in Germany. Well, as far as our experiences are concerned, well, where institutions are, you also see who the affected people are. But well, in total, we have 12 such institutions with 41 places for about 29,000 men in 2021. For 2022, data is not yet official, but I did my own analysis, and we expect 31,000 people who are affected by violence in households, and about 70,000 men affected by household violence, and 31,000 partnership violence. So wherever there's an offer, this offer is very well appreciated. There are, of course, fluctuations and difficulties, especially in rural areas. Thank you very much. Now, Andreas Haase. So from the consultancy real world, what is happening on the front line? Well, just a couple of words on myself. I have been working in this field for 30 years, well, on a voluntary basis first, and then I became a specialist, and through continuous education, I then became a therapist. I used to be an engineer, and I worked as a trainer, as a freelancer, but now it has become my most important job. We assist men throughout their entire life. We do not receive any funding, so men have to pay for the services, and their problems range from alcohol abuse to burnout to violence. We do not provide addiction consultancy because it's another problem, but we provide consultancy against about different types of disorders. And we also work with offenders, as it was the case for Heidelberg, and with men who are victims of violence. We have been working in that field for 30 years. Our programs are always full. And interestingly, we have more than 50% of people who come to us on a voluntary basis. They do not come from institutions. These are people who come to us and tell us that they fell victims of violence by their wife. Well, it's a delicate field, you know, because the judiciary wants these cases to be reported because it's a criminal offense, but we do not want to move into that situation. We then set up a hotline for violence, for men victims of violence, and this hotline has been working for 3 years, and it's very well. It's very successful. In peak time, we have to we had to activate 2 lines. and well, we try and identify what men need, if they need a therapist or a consultancy service, and so they are then referred to the relevant offices. The only thing that we can do is to refer these people to the relevant centers. Do you have enough consultancy centers? As I said before, there are areas, densely populated areas where we can provide a good level of service. In rural areas, it's a bit more difficult. They may have to go to a larger city, but I would say we have a pretty good number of consultancy centers, and if not, we can resort to Caritas centers or to other centers in the neighborhood. I would say the cooperation is quite good. And most of our staff members are men. And then going back to the first question, how can we reach men? Well, it's also a quality matter. So you have to try and reach the same level of socialization in order to reduce the obstacle as much as possible. And usually when we talk to these people on the hotline, we realize that these people tended to be reluctant, and well, a long time passed before they were courageous enough to call the hotline. But they prefer to call because they remain anonymous, and they can speak about what they want. On average, we receive 1.6 phone calls per hour. Call usually last about 30 minutes. And I think it's a good number, and numbers are increasing. The second offer that we've also developed, and we are in contact with Jana. We have protection residencies in North Rhine-Westphalia, and so we offer accommodation opportunities for men with their children. Most importantly, violence is committed at home. So it's a domestic violence committed by the partner or by fathers or brothers. With young migrants, for example, we have such episodes of violence. If they do not behave as the family wants, they are usually victims of violence committed by their fathers. So we have a very wide range of possible acts of violence. Also, men who were obliged to marry another their wife, also often victims of violence. Okay, let's get now into the details of this topic. Well, the WEISSER Ring offers only victim support. But what is interesting is to hear that in the same organization you offer both offender support and victim support. And well, you know, this may be also a downside, especially considering that men are usually perceived as offenders rather than as victims. So going back to what we already said, why did you decide to process, let's say, at the same time, both the offender support and the victim support? For us as WEISSER Ring, it would be a sort of contradiction. Also concerning the definition itself. Well, if I can go back one step, the fact that we work simultaneously with offenders and victims. Personally, I think the most important thing is to stop private violence, regardless of whether you are an offender or a victim. The situation may quickly reverse. But we often work with female offenders, for example, and well, you know, if a man comes and he was a victim of domestic violence and his partner is also with him, well, this is something which is relatively different from the offering that associations for the support of women offer. I know it's a mix, but these are dynamic processes, and we cannot clearly distinguish between who is the offender, who the victims are, and this goes back to the definition of violence. What do I experience in terms of violence, and what do children experience in terms of violence too? I think well, incidentally, in if we work with children in elementary school about domestic violence, for example, they often describe what they experience at home, but they do not perceive that as violence because it's normal, you know. This happens at home. And, well, they tend to say when mom and dad quarrel and fight, well, I break something down so that they focus on me rather than on their fight. And it's so a sort of taking on the responsibility for quarreling. And so we also have an impact on the role of the different people at home. Well, I must say there are specific segments in life where the distinction between offenders and victims is not that clear. So I'm not surprised when I see that consultancy is provided both to offenders and victims. Well, you know, also in a divorce situation where a person may be considered as a victim but not necessarily of violence. Well, this is something which has been evolving in the last 30 years. Men has become increasingly victims of violence. Well, you know, my father has beaten me up, but I haven't become an offender. It depends on the type of experience you have with violence and the fact that these episodes of violence will characterize your future life depends actually on you. And so it's no surprise that we serve both groups of customers, let's say, in one individual setting or in the same association or in the same consultancy center. On the other hand, I think this has also evolved historically because first we started working on offenders and then little by little victims approached us as well. So this is absolutely true also concerning the definition and also well, the function of violence for masculinity or for men. Well, it's not necessarily negative. Experiencing or exercising violence it has to do with the power, with strength, with expression of power and identity. It's not necessarily a negative feature. The fact of imposing oneself is per se not a negative feature. Of course, if you hit your partner in order to establish your authority is not good, but it's simply an expression of strength and power. The fact of experiencing the role of a victim too is not necessarily negative. Although if you fall victim of violence, you are no longer a man unless you have a specific problem. So for this reason, you react and you want to become stronger, and that's the reason for reacting in violent terms. But it's also a question of perception. We live in a world in which movies show how men beat up women, and this could be considered as a sign of strength and not the other way around. And many things are not represented as violent. And I think this mix of approaches puts the focus on the offender, but this experience as a victim is usually absolutely neglected, both at a societal level and at an individual and political level. And this creates all those white spots on the map where men can hardly be reached. So we talked about the obstacles in active consultancy. I still remember when I worked at the hotline, which was absolutely anonymous, and that's a good starting point, especially for providing consultancy to men. And I remember that the typical picture of men was sporty and tall and strong men, and when you wonder why they fell into this situation. So the problem is that they have that obstacle due to the image of masculinity that is so widespread in our society. So the question is, how do we react as a society when men appear to be in need of support, and what do you perceive in your work? So what kind of obstacles do we have with men compared with women when they look for help? And well, for sure, the picture of the image of masculinity is important.
So I believe that the question is whether they actually can understand that they can be offered help, comparing to the way this is portrayed on the website. So is this a type of service in which you can go and speak to somebody, and if they are not pictured as big victims, probably they would reach out more. And then the type of offer, so we think about more remote areas that are not urban areas. They're more difficult to reach, and probably they wouldn't call, or maybe if they did call the police, they wouldn't be taken seriously. So the situation would escalate. Therefore, it is important to take into account a male-centered perspective, so with flyers and adverts and so on and so forth. Well, Yes, I believe that this is an example which is telling, and it's something that fits into the picture. So we had one of those elements that what we called as a segment. So the fact that they're physically strong is what anchors them to their own reality. That is the reason why it is relevant to acknowledge such elements and take them on board. So this is one of the many, of course, connected to some sort of ambiguity that men perceive within themselves. So they want to be strong, they want to match such ideal, but this is a mismatch actually to what they experience. Therefore, when we actually manage to take this aspect under control, our work is more effective. Actually, we are a consultancy office for offenders as well. So, generally, men tend to um, shift the blame. So my colleague did this and that, and my partner did this and that. And there is always somebody else in the picture, and there is always some element which is not violence related. It's more peaceful, and that is the way they perceive it. So that is also a shift in terms of how you perceive yourself as a victim. So in the school, you started this. So I'm the victim here. So I'm the big victim here. Yeah, it's a kind of uh, way to compete. So, but the fact that they do feel helpless, yeah, maybe that has to do with guilt. So, who is guilty? Well, you started, so that's obviously the question. And so they don't know what to do, and they feel helpless as men. How can I move on? How can I continue? So, from a male perspective, obviously, this does not fit into the picture as we said. So oftentimes we hear men say, "Oh, well, this is the first time ever I tell this to anyone." Well, they are ashamed. Yeah, and they're not used to it. And with women, for example, when I speak to her, or when my wife speaks to a friend over the phone, that can last like 45 minutes to talk about one thing only, because they're carried away in a way. Therefore, there is a huge difference between women and men from this viewpoint. They're not as carried away by events, by successes, and by things that might go wrong. They're just not used to it. So, yeah, being used to it itself would be an element of shame. Well, that depends on the examples, the role models that they experienced at home. When I think back to how my father behaved, for example. So, yeah, maybe we can touch upon another point, the Plan International Studies. That is a study that showed us actually quite a few figures when taking into account people supporting violence against a partner, for example. So that's always the flip side of the coin, as we said. What is the expectation? What happens between playing the victim and being the offender? So violence and non-violence. So obviously there are quite a few open questions left to be dealt with by the study. That is the reason why I wouldn't define that as a study. So um, these are data that are available on online. So 1,000 men and 1,000 women. So is this representative at all? So there are quite a few question marks. that are left open and unanswered. So maybe the questions should be drafted in a more complex way so that the whole landscape can be analyzed in a better way. So, but that's already a good thing that we're actually talking about such a topic also at a federal level as we're doing today. So I would like to ask another question. So based on your practical experience, the summary that is given in terms of how you go about your feelings. 71% of male respondents believe that they can solve problems on their own without asking for help. And then otherwise they would feel excessively sensitive, and quite high percentages testify to that. So 55% actually stated that they wish to prove time and again that they're real men. So again, we should first define what a real man is, and they would like to avoid being perceived as feminine, and that's almost 50%. 50% also stated that they would like to have the last word when actually quarreling or fighting with a partner. So there's obviously opens the door to violence in the couple life. So these were just a few figures. What is your perspective on this? So you have already started talking about this, but that is a picture that shows a part of our own reality, and I don't think that comes as a surprise. So, as you said, I will not question the percentages. Is that plus 1%, minus 1%? However, this has to do with the totalitarian study, the nature of the study itself, maybe focus in Bielefeld or elsewhere. So are there perspectives that need to be further taken into account in human misanthropic attitudes, racist attitudes, and so on and so forth? So this might have an impact onto those results as well. So when they state, yeah, I think about the way I come across, whether I am perceived as manly or not, well, obviously 90% would say, yes, this is important. But what is this type of masculinity? Okay, maybe there would be that would be rather half-half. So there is a good 50% of the male population that now perceives being a man as actually helping out in the household, taking care of the children, and so on and so forth. So actually, not just being the breadwinner. And then when we talk about conflicts, I believe that these are important times of change, and if they can be supported in a positive way, we can bring about some sort of disruptive changes, as we said. So how can men move away from those old values so that they can embrace the new ones, such as supporting your partner, being more emotional and emotionally available, being more supportive? So how can we support that in the society in which we live overall? So at a federal level, we see that we only have 41 centers to help out men who actually try and escape a violent situation at home. I think this is quite a scandal, because we need to develop those topics further. So yeah, Andreas. So yeah, so all right. We are speaking about figures pertaining to a specific age group, 18 to 35. So when we talk about our own experience in the consultancy and counseling business, how many people in this age group do ring up? And this is the age group on which we can work more and be more active, as we said. So are they disappointed? Are they exasperated, as we said? So as Klaus has already said, let's look at the picture. There is a sort of ambivalence. Men are ambivalent. So how do they behave within the couple, with their partner? So how do they try and strike a balance between their working life, building a career, and supporting maybe their first child? So how do they manage conflicts? Do they trust themselves when they try and express their feelings? Did they learn that as children? Did they see that being played out by their parents? Obviously, men need to learn a new language in which they can express their own feelings and requirements. So when I'm desperate, when I'm disappointed because I feel like I'm put into a corner by my partner asking things of me, what will I do? That is when violence comes into place, or used to come into the picture. So, and then we have to face consequences that were maybe unexpected because I snapped for 30 seconds. So maybe the disappointment in younger generations shows us that there is a change in the perception of masculinity. So phenomena such as the ones that are described in the study, and then Andrew Tate on TikTok, I believe that's a person with like thousands of millions and billions of clicks, and he really does anything, everything and anything possible. So where does that come from, right? This need to show off and playing the offender, playing the rapist. That's something that wouldn't be expected. It's a kind of backlash. And that's exactly what you were mentioning with reference to politics, moving from right wing to left wing and then back to right wing. And so we have stated time and again that in our society we want to change the picture, we want to offer help, and we want to change the situation that we live in our society. But yet again, a sort of backlash. So what do men need to move into that direction, to actually manage this ambiguity in our society? But what can we do as help centers to offer them the support they need? What type of support do they need to start with, and what gaps are there to be filled? So we can, I can speak based on the experience of the WEISSER RING, our organization. So, for example, when I have to come up with a campaign, how will we create that, and so on and so forth. So when violence, as we've stated time and again, creates calmness and respect, obviously this is reflected in a positive way onto the men, considering those old values of masculinity. So we need to move away from such values towards new ones. So what is the game changer so that men stop hitting, stop being violent. So what is the pro here for that specific person? Maybe we should try and understand that. So again, there would be ambivalent violence. Let's think about the army. So people go into war as it is happening right now in Ukraine. So there is a picture within the picture, so to speak. So then so somebody who works in on a production line and wants to take off to take 2 months of parental leave, what will they be told? Well, the manager will say, look, I need you here, what are you doing? So they need more support in our society overall. So at a political level, at a counseling level, so we need to actually get to the men who are part of this leadership, and so with the managers and so on and so forth. Look at what happens to Sweden, in Sweden. So they can actually take up to a year off for parental leave, and it is quite odd when they don't do it. So, for example, in our case, when we talk about handiwork, that would be odd as well, because we're expected to be multitasking in a different way. So we need to support our household and still take care of everything else as well. So from a positive viewpoint, maybe in Heidelberg 30 years ago, we started off with this project. So there was no sexual violence, no rapes, no nothing. So actually, starting off from that point, a lot of things have happened. However, we need to take a look at the bigger picture. So in terms of training, education, so the study developments and so on and so forth, so that we actually start off quite early, when we deal with those topics. So we have 8 staff who go to schools. They are pedagogically trained, and they can actually translate all this into theatrical modes. And they tell us that things are becoming more and more complex. So the professors, for example, are trying to do their best to change the role models, but somehow this is not actually happening. Maybe because they don't have the resources. And also take into account the fact that classes are getting bigger. Classes themselves are getting bigger and bigger. They're packed. So I wouldn't go to a school psychologist as a child in school age. So maybe we should invest more to support the schools, and actually with external skills and consultancy opportunities that are offered. So would that have a positive effect? Yes, of course. So for example, there is another hotline for women. We have 2 women who work with young girls, and they also are active in the elementary school. Most of the staff are women, so it's a bit odd to see that maybe men come into the classroom to speak, because the only men that they generally see are the school principal and maybe another teacher. So of course, this is not just gender specific. I don't want to separate the two genders here when we talk about violence and gender/sex related topics. But we also have to take into account all those elements and consider the cost that entails. And I believe that there is a strong need thereof. So we need to experience all this. So men can't, it's not true that men can't speak. And they just need to learn how to. And they need to be encouraged a bit in the beginning. So it's not like a handicap that they're born with, a skill which is lacking. So we need to invest more.
But you need to be ready to invest. Well, there's a demand, of course. If politicians require that, then an increasing number of men would apply for this job. So on the one hand, we have to advertise this a little bit more, but on the other hand, we also have to obtain the support of the politicians. Well, for example, in your case, you need to provide, for example, those accommodation facilities. But this is not yet the case. There is the Istanbul Convention, and according to the Istanbul Convention, men can be victim of violence too. And so why people are not ready to negotiate on this topic. So we need to take a top-down approach. First of all, we need the consensus of politicians, and then we need demand. But the problem is that for any reasons whatsoever, politicians do not want to focus on that topic. And in my opinion, we cannot be successful in that. So this is, as I said, the flip side of the coin. Well, I would like to say something on that because, well, the Istanbul Convention is important, and we also discussed that concerning the victims, and usually women are considered as victims and not men. And well, this is a great problem, I think, because a group of victims is rejected versus another group which has to be considered as more important. So my question is as follows. Do you also collaborate with women support organizations? Because I think this is very urgent. I think there's no comprehension from that viewpoint. We in the WEISSER Ring, we see that women protection associations have a lot of expertise in their field, and I dare say they do not want to focus on other groups of victims. They are a bit too restricted in their work. If we want to change the society, we should establish a much better communication relationship, so as so that other groups of victims can be perceived as such. Yes, we do collaborate with women protection associations. And I also realize that there is a sort of a competition. So there's the legitimate fear that if you include more groups, you have a smaller slice of the cake, of the pie. That's the problem. So if you just throw the pie to the rest of the group, you just end up fighting for a bigger slice. That's why I was saying that politicians are encouraged to enlarge this pie, to make this pie bigger. And this is what we are now working at. Well, so far we haven't been very successful, but I think we should move into that direction. We must join the forces and we must pull the forces together in order to let our voice listened by politicians, focusing on the Istanbul Convention, but also implementing this in the first place. I know it's very demanding. And we know that conservatives or traditionalist groups tend not to consider that. For example, the AfD party, which is very masculine, I would say, do not want to invest in that. AfD, masculinity-oriented groups reject all this. And so they do not want, because they say they do not want to promote feminist groups instead. But we as associations want to focus on the avoidance of violence, but it all boils down to circumstances, to family background, and to societal problems. The fact that it is still a taboo if you talk about men who are victims of violence. And I'm very happy to see that the WEISSER Ring is becoming increasingly active in this field. Well, we know that this is a dark spot, and there are many non-reported cases in this field that we want to highlight. Well, in general, I can say that well, in Germany, this is still a taboo. During the corona pandemic, we know that a lot was said and discussed about, for example, domestic violence against women. But we also realized that little was given to the regions for establishing, for example, accommodation facilities for women. And well, that's the problem of politicians. It's not that the different groups are working individually. And well, I really like the metaphor of the pie, which is becoming smaller and smaller. And that's quite that's quite important, because, you know, we should not fight against one another. We should work together in order to get a bigger pie. And that's the mechanism. We have to find a mechanism whereby politicians play with us and not against us. Last week, for example, we talked about how to manage violence, terrorism-related violence, which is completely different from domestic violence, for example. So we all work individually, and so does the politicians. If I can compliment, well, this competition over the same pie and with women associations. This is due to the very little infrastructures that we have. Women facilities, for example, they are overfilled with women, and politicians do not do anything. Our work wouldn't have been possible without the support of women in the city council and by women responsible for these topics. And if I look at the audience, I see that most of the people are women, and so women provide a great contribution. I just wanted to point this out because this is important. And do you also have a good level of cooperation? Yes, well, the community levels are very well connected. Well, the city council and the various consultancy centers for women. I wouldn't say there's a competition. Sometimes we have the impression that well, not all are working correctly. I would say, well, well, I cannot rule that out. But this boils down to the individual person, actually, who start these kinds of debate. Well, we also see the changes in the equal opportunities in municipalities, for example. Well, there's an increasing number of women, and well, colleagues may perceive that in a different way. But well, this is the case in all situations, both in municipalities, in associations, at a regional level. But we have a very good level of cooperation with women associations. And we also have a very good level of shared initiatives. If you work isolated in an isolated way, well, this cannot work. If I can contribute with something positive at organization level, we also work together with women association, for example, the social services for Muslim women, and but they also have fathers group, and so they decided to establish a sort of institutional network, and they are in different associations. We also have an equal opportunity office where both men and women are represented. They are also interested in men-related questions, and so we have a very good level of cooperation. I would say we no longer work in silos, but we tend to work with a cooperative approach. With your consultancy offer, for example, are you also approached by people with a migration background, or is it not the case? It depends. Well, as far as accommodation facilities are concerned, for sure, and also with offenders work in the normal men consultancy, much less, but simply because it is not funded as a service, and many men cannot afford paying for the consultancy services. We receive inquiries about for working with refugees, but we also have language problems. But again, the problem is funding. But as far as accommodation is concerned, we receive a lot of phone calls. Well, we can say, I can confirm what I heard. We have about 30% of people with migration background, and so that's quite important. This is a very interesting topic. If I may, I perform some consultancy services sometimes, and I come across people with a migration background. They come from the EU, maybe from Poland, for example, but they have a different background. You know, they have a different cultural background, and when we work with these people, processes are very interesting. And so again, the evolution of the men's and women's picture in society, but this is something we cannot focus on in this roundtable. We should dedicate a separate panel to this. But it's interesting, you know, because it's a multifaceted issue. Where we, for example, people are referred to us from the judiciary, but they cannot afford a translator, so we can hardly work with them because the costs of a translator would be higher than the cost of the services, and bringing children who can translate for them doesn't make any sense. So working with people with migration background is interesting. The problem is that they are not defined as victims of violence. It depends on the experience they had, but we have about 1/4 of the people who have a migration background, maybe the third generation of Turkish families, and they are still considered as people with migration background. Anything from the audience? Yes, Manuela again. Yes, a point which has been a bit neglected. Well, I hear that there's a lot to do from a societal viewpoint. On the one hand, men tend to be very individualistic, and they do not want to ask for help. And on the other hand, men had or have to have specific experiences in order to feel this right of asking for help. And I also see that there are families who can profit from that. And you mentioned the example of Sweden. For example, the fact of becoming multitasking. Well, if you second one of your employee to a foreign country, well, they learn to become multitasking, and this can be exploited, of course, but it can also be considered as a potential. The same applies to this situation. If we can make men stronger, all the parties involved would win. And I think this is what we really mean, what we really should focus on. If we want to progress, we have to try and make men more resilient and stronger, so that all the parties involved can benefit. And of course, at the same time, we need also the conditions, the political and the societal conditions for all this to happen. And well, we have been discussing with the politicians for a couple of months, but this is not enough. There must be political incentives so that this issue is properly perceived by the whole of society. I think we should go two ways at the same time. On the one hand, we should highlight the disadvantages of toxic masculinity. And this means not that you as a man are toxic, but rather that toxic masculinity is not good for anyone, especially for men. There are a lot of dangers, a lot of risks. Then we have health-related issues, then prison, homelessness, and so on and so forth. And these are all men-related themes, and there are costs related to the toxic masculinity. A book was written on that, but this should be pointed out, and it should become a point of discussion. On the other hand, we also should wonder what men can win out of that. So we need to create possibilities. We need to create spaces where men can make experience. And again, another positive anecdote. These 2 weeks of parental leave that was approved by the European Union, and finally we obtained this in Germany too. These 2 weeks of parental leave is extremely important, and this is a very precious space for communicating, because we say, hey man, you finally have the chance of enjoying these 2 weeks, and the companies have to accept that. And well, you know, there could be even a risk for parental leaves to become longer than maternal leaves, for example. Well, all these things should be exploited on the one hand and communicated on the other, so that men can become aware of the need for this space, and the fact that fathers also want to see their children grow up is very important. That's a very important approach. Well, even if you monetize this for companies, there's no disadvantage at all. Of course, there are a lot of emotional issues that come into play. And well, costs have been calculated if men fall victims of violence and cannot work and are out of the society. Well, we could do the same. So we could show companies how high the costs of violence against men can become. Going back to what Klaus said, if we focus on studies, everything boils down to this 30% of men who commit violence. And why don't we focus on that 70% of people who actually want to live differently? And this is what we want to encourage. We have to encourage this type of behavior and not the other way around. Well, this is something which comes up to my mind. You usually tend to focus on this 30% of problematic men, but instead of that, we should encourage the others, the remaining 70%, with campaigns or well, the fact that men can engage in looking after their children, for example. And so this can be very important. Men usually reach out to us when they are desperate, not simply because they need some help or because they are referred to us. So they are in a sort of mandatory path. So either they were obliged to come to us, or they were so desperate that they had no other option. The idea is also to act as mentors, especially with young adults. Well, in this respect, in working with offenders and working with men, well, you said that many men report spontaneously their case, and this percentage is above 50%. The situation has changed, but well, in many cases they do not come spontaneously. Their wife, for example, sends them, and we've seen that we see that a successful solution is when people realize, when men realize that they can get something for themselves as well. So not only their children or their wives can benefit from that, but also there's something to win for them, and so that's really the key point. If you consider the larger framework, we can say, of course, well, in 2017, domestic violence cost 3 billion euros, and then due to the inflation, the cost has become much higher. But you know, you never calculate the benefit that the individual people have, and I think this is something we should focus on. People have to realize that they can obtain something for themselves, not only in terms of societal benefits, of happiness and satisfaction and economic power, but also for themselves. Klaus said that men learn through repetition, but also by hand, heart, and brain. So people have to see that they did something for themselves. It's a sort of redundancy which has become well established. So, well, that's a very good statement that allows me to draw to the conclusions. Well, the final question is about violence committed by women. So, very final round of remarks. But for associations like the WEISSER RING, for example, what would you wish to have from politicians? What should happen so that progress can be made on this topic, so that we can better reach men victims of violence? Andreas. Well, to reach men, I think that they should be reached in their desperation, in their despair, and well, the hotline is very effective. It's a low threshold option. It's anonymous, and that's important. It's also important to provide an offer which is also visible, otherwise people do not know where to go. But as far as labor as far as our work is concerned, I would wish politicians recognize our work and so that we do not only work on a project basis, but that our work is finally recognized and acknowledged by politicians and society as a whole. Well, I think public relations should also be strengthened because we need to raise awareness among the citizens in terms of domestic violence against men and women. second issue is that sometimes we do not realize that children are affected as well. And in childhood, people know how to cope with conflicts, but if a spiral begins at that age, it cannot but become worse and worse. So, well, and then as far as politicians are concerned, I think we should also include children in men protection facilities, for example. Children are not included when fathers bring their children with them, just 1 out of 10 cases. So, well, children are there, but there's nothing for them. There are no financial possibilities to work with them too. And also from a staff perspective, unfortunately, we do not have any specialists in children's work. And I wish politicians can work a little bit more on that. So I know that in women consultancy, this is an aspect which is taken much more into consideration. I wish this would be the case for men as well. Well, I guess that, well, the WEISSER Ring is already very successful, but I hope that when consultancy is provided, consultants provide a consultancy from the viewpoint of men, that they realize what the real needs of men are in the different fields. When men are advised, we need reflection, men-related reflection, and a men-related approach. As far as politics is concerned, I wish we have I wish they take on responsibility at all level. At state level, they have to support the structures so that regions and municipalities can act accordingly in consulting and advising men who are victims of domestic violence. If I look at the sustainability goals, I think we should focus on the positive features of being a man in the societal debate. So moving from this toxic masculinity to a more positive approach as far as the men-related features are concerned. And this is this in the context of the SDGs, but also in terms of hegemony, so men dominating the economic world. So again, sustainable masculinity is something that we should focus on and that we can further strengthen. Well, this is certainly something we should reflect upon, but I've written down that, so thank you very much. Well, for me, and for us who are not so strongly characterized and influenced by politics, well, I think that men consultancy should become, rather than a nice to have, a political pillar too in city councils and in the city institutions, instead of just devoting a couple of people in the city council. And this can really make a difference. Well, we have been under project financing for 25 years. And if next year we can move to institutional financing, this would be a great step forward. Well, we need, of course, good people in consultancy, but you cannot get these specialists if there's no funding, and so it's a question of financial resources. There's always a sort of dichotomy because we do not advertise because well, in our district we do not need any advertising, and well, you know, if we have enough financial resources and if we are better structured, we would have more men coming to us. So this is basically what I would wish. But I would say in the past 25 years, a lot has been done. And so I think we have improved in terms of violence. Well, very good. So I'm so happy about this conversation because we finally pointed out the positive aspects of this issue. So I've taken a lot of notes. So thank you very much for the lively conversation. Thank you, and I hope and I think we will meet again to discuss this topic, and so we hope we will be able to reach out to men, and we hope that the society can contribute, and thank you very much for the positive insights. Thank you for the very profitable conversation.